Hi everyone. Tonight we're going to drift into the distant past, into the chill of northern Europe more than 1,000 years ago, into the world of longhouses, thick wool cloaks, crackling fires, and simple routines guided not by alarms or glowing screens but by the stars and the seasons, and we'll explore why the people of the Viking Age, in their quiet villages nestled in fjords and forests, may have experienced some of the most restful and healthy sleep in all of human history. To begin understanding why Viking sleep might have been so optimal, we first need to understand the structure of their daily lives, and the rhythm of their days, which were almost entirely dictated by the natural environment, since the concept of time as we know it today, measured in precise minutes and hours by synchronized clocks, did not yet exist for them. Instead, they woke up when the sky began to lighten, worked while the sun was high, and went to sleep not when they wanted to squeeze in one more episode of a show or answer one more email, but when darkness made it impractical or unsafe to keep going, which usually meant that they slept shortly after sunset and didn't wake again until the return of natural light, giving them up to 9 or even 10 hours of sleep during the long winter nights. The architecture of Viking homes also played a role in promoting deeper, more consistent sleep, and while today we think of heating systems and artificial insulation as keys to comfort, these people managed to create a sleeping environment that was both protective and calming without the benefit of modern conveniences, using longhouses built from timber and packed with turf or clay to trap warmth and muffle sound, which meant that inside the home, temperatures remained stable and the noise of wind or wildlife was softened, creating a cocoon-like atmosphere perfect for sleep, particularly in winter, when snow piled high outside and the house became a warm den of stillness. Within these longhouses, multiple families or extended kin often lived together, and the fire in the central hearth burned through the night not only to keep the cold away but also to provide a steady source of low, flickering light and a gentle crackling sound, both of which are now used in modern sleep aids. In fact, studies today show that consistent, low-level ambient sound like that of a fire can promote deeper sleep cycles by masking more disruptive noises, and though the Vikings didn't have white noise machines, their firelit evenings created a very similar effect naturally. Their beds were usually placed along the walls of the house, raised slightly off the ground to avoid cold drafts and covered in furs or woven blankets made from sheep's wool, which is now known to regulate body temperature better than most other materials. And because the materials were all natural and breathable, they helped prevent overheating or chills during the night, a factor we now recognize as crucial to achieving uninterrupted deep sleep cycles, especially during the slow-breathing states of NREM sleep. Just as important as the sleeping environment was the fact that people in the Viking Age had no access to artificial light sources, other than fire or perhaps occasional moonlight, which meant their circadian rhythms were tightly aligned with the sun, and this is something modern science is only just beginning to understand the importance of. The suppression of melatonin caused by blue light from phones, TVs, or even LED bulbs is now linked to widespread sleep disorders. But Viking societies never faced this problem, and their eyes gradually adjusted to darkness each evening as candles burned low and fires settled, letting melatonin flow freely and triggering natural drowsiness right on cue. Another often overlooked element in the sleep of early Northern Europeans was the social component. Many people did not sleep entirely alone but were instead in the presence of family members, which created a sense of safety and reduced anxiety levels. And it's well documented that humans tend to sleep more deeply when they feel secure, and though we might now find the idea of sharing a room or a bed with several relatives odd or uncomfortable, it actually contributed to a strong feeling of connection, which reduced cortisol and other stress hormones in the body, both of which interfere with deep sleep when elevated. Their diets also contributed to more restful nights, as Viking Age meals were typically rich in complex carbohydrates like barley, root vegetables, and porridge, all of which promote the production of serotonin, which is a precursor to melatonin. And because meals were often consumed early in the evening and digestion was allowed to occur naturally over time, their bodies were not burdened by late-night snacks or high-sugar foods that are now known to cause blood sugar spikes and crashes, leading to nighttime waking and reduced REM sleep. Interestingly, there is some archaeological evidence suggesting that the people of Scandinavia in the early medieval period also practiced what modern researchers call segmented sleep, a pattern in which people would sleep for 4 to 5 hours, then wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and then go back to sleep until dawn, and during this waking period they might tend the fire, whisper stories, or even engage in quiet forms of prayer or reflection, which again aligns with Modern theories about how humans may be biologically wired for this two-phase sleep, which may have allowed for deeper and more regenerative rest than the single, consolidated block we now aim for. There was also far less noise pollution. No distant highways. No air conditioning units clicking on and off. No glowing electronics buzzing. Only the hush of wind through the trees, the distant calls of night animals, or perhaps the soft murmurs of sleepers nearby. And because the daily tasks of Viking life were physically demanding, from rowing and fishing to farming and foraging, the body was often tired in a natural way by evening, not from mental overstimulation but from real movement and outdoor activity, which created a healthy sleep pressure and made it easier to fall into deep sleep quickly. And while we often romanticize ancient life, it's important to note that sleep was not always perfect. Seasonal light shifts in the far north could be extreme, and illnesses or harsh weather might disrupt routines, but on average, the Viking Age person slept in greater alignment with their environment, their biology, and their community than most modern humans do today, and this connection between body, earth, and season is something we are only just starting to rediscover through modern science, even as we try to recreate the conditions they lived in naturally, with blackout curtains, melatonin, supplements, and guided sleep sounds. In the next part, we'll look more deeply into how the design of Viking longhouses evolved to support better sleep and how the symbolism of night and rest was tied into their cultural beliefs, especially in Norse mythology, where dreams were not just random illusions but sometimes seen as messages from gods or ancestors, which may have influenced how the Vikings understood the value of sleep not just for health, but for wisdom. To truly understand why the people of the Viking Age may have experienced such consistently restorative sleep, we need to look closer at their architectural choices, not simply in terms of shelter and warmth, but in how their living spaces reflected a deeper understanding of comfort, rhythm, and nighttime peace, which might surprise us when compared to today's fast-paced and overstimulated world, where bedrooms often double as offices, gyms, or entertainment centers, whereas in Viking households, the night was reserved for rest, and everything about their longhouses supported that singular purpose. The traditional Viking longhouse, known in Old Norse as a langus, was often built with thick wooden planks, sealed with turf or clay, and had only one or two narrow openings that served as windows, meaning the interior remained dim even during daylight hours and became pitch black once the sun had gone down. And while that might sound gloomy by modern standards, this consistent darkness actually helped reinforce the body's natural circadian cues. The complete absence of artificial light allowed melatonin production to ramp up uninterrupted, preparing their bodies and minds for restful sleep without the hormonal confusion we now experience from phones and LED lights glowing just inches from our eyes. Inside, the hearth was always the heart of the house, and though we might think of it now as just a source of heat or a place to cook, it also served as a kind of emotional anchor. Its soft crackling created a meditative atmosphere, and the flicker of flames cast slow-moving shadows on the walls, which may have had a naturally hypnotic effect on the brain, easing people into a dreamlike state even before their heads touched the fur-covered sleeping benches along the outer walls. These benches, by the way, were not just functional. They were often built into the architecture of the house itself, forming sturdy platforms that were slightly raised off the floor to avoid the cold and to separate sleeping areas from livestock or storage areas. Remember, many Viking homes sheltered animals during harsh winters, and this arrangement created a sort of barrier between the sleeper and the colder, messier parts of the longhouse, allowing for a cleaner, more private experience of rest even in communal living. Moreover, Viking longhouses were surprisingly good at maintaining a steady indoor climate, thanks to the way the roof sloped steeply and allowed smoke to rise and slowly filter out through a vent or a loose thatching section, which meant that the interior never filled entirely with smoke, and at the same time that warm air didn't escape too quickly, creating a thermal balance that made the house feel like a well-insulated cocoon. Even during the freezing Scandinavian nights, this warmth, combined with heavy woolen clothing and thick animal hides, meant that sleep was rarely disrupted by cold snaps or sudden drafts. Another fascinating dimension of Viking sleep was how it intertwined with their spiritual beliefs. Dreams were not seen as meaningless fragments of memory or stress, but often interpreted as significant omens or messages from the divine, especially in the context of Norse mythology, where gods and ancestors could appear during sleep to give advice, warnings, or visions of the future. And this belief system lent sleep a sacred quality. reinforcing the idea that to sleep well was not just a bodily function, but a way to connect with something larger and unseen. Certain sagas and Eddic poems even mention dreams as pivotal moments of prophecy or transformation, suggesting that sleep itself was a time when the boundaries between the worlds, the mortal and the divine, grew thinner, and this cultural view likely encouraged people to protect and value their sleep deeply, just as they would protect the quiet moments of prayer or ritual. And so the evening hours were not filled with frantic activity or distraction, but rather marked by a gradual wind down, a period of storytelling, wool spinning, or quiet carving that allowed the mind to settle before sleep. In fact, there is strong archaeological evidence that Vikings maintained a structured household rhythm, where certain tasks were reserved for certain times of day: grinding grain, mending sails, curing meat, all of which demanded physical effort, but also ensured that by nightfall, the body was ready to rest, not wired from inactivity or from mental stimulation, but naturally fatigued and calmed, which aligns with modern research showing that physical exertion, especially when performed in natural light, significantly improves the depth and duration of sleep. Importantly, Viking families did not separate themselves the way many modern families do, with each person retreating to a private, sealed-off bedroom. Instead, multiple generations often slept in close proximity, which created a sense of social connection and physical warmth that reduced anxiety, improved emotional regulation, and promoted oxytocin release, all of which are now recognized as contributing to more stable sleep. And while we may not wish to replicate this exact model, it's worth considering how our isolation in modern bedrooms can sometimes work against our instinctual need for safety through proximity. Sleep, for the Vikings, was also more deeply tied to the land and the seasons, since agricultural cycles dictated when to plant, harvest, and rest. And because winters were long and the days were short, the human body was allowed to follow a slower, more forgiving pace, with natural naps taken during the dark afternoons and longer nights stretching from early evening to late morning. Compare that to today's rigid schedules, where daylight saving time, alarm clocks, and backlit screens override our natural biological instincts, forcing sleep to happen on command rather than in rhythm with the Earth's signals. Even the sounds that surrounded Viking households were different. There were no humming refrigerators, no passing cars, no midnight advertisements flashing through an apartment window. Only the soft shuffle of livestock, the wind threading through timber beams, and the occasional howling of wolves or owls far from the safety of the home, all of which created an ambient world that, while not silent, was consistent and natural. And this type of sonic environment has been shown to reduce nighttime waking, lower heart rates, and promote deeper non-REM sleep phases. Their diet, too, continued to support sleep in subtle ways. Evening meals were typically simple and heavy on starches, such as stewed grains, boiled root vegetables, or dried fish soaked in broth, which released energy slowly over hours and helped prevent blood sugar crashes in the middle of the night, a common reason for disrupted sleep in the modern world where processed sugars and caffeine linger in the body. And because food preparation took hours without modern tools, meals were eaten earlier in the evening, giving the digestive system plenty of time to slow down before bed. And while the Viking world could be harsh, violent, and uncertain, filled with raids, shifting alliances, and unpredictable weather, their approach to sleep remained surprisingly consistent, and it's this consistency that likely gave them a resilience few modern people can relate to. For while today we struggle to get 6 hours of fragmented rest between digital distractions and endless obligations, Viking-age sleepers allowed themselves to surrender fully to the night, without resistance, knowing that rest was not a luxury or a personal indulgence, but an essential part of survival, healing, and spiritual clarity. As we move deeper into the quiet world of Viking-era life, it's important to recognize how rest was not just something people did at the end of the day, but an integral part of a much larger rhythm that defined how the community operated, interacted, and even survived. And one of the most overlooked aspects of this rhythm was the connection between physical activity, social cohesion, and natural fatigue, which together created the ideal conditions for consistent, healthy, uninterrupted sleep. Not because people tried to optimize their sleep, but because everything around them was structured in a way that made good sleep almost inevitable. From the moment a Viking woke up, their body was engaged in a series of meaningful tasks, whether it was preparing the fire, tending to livestock, hauling water from a nearby stream, splitting wood, gathering herbs, or mending fishing nets. All of these actions required strength, coordination, and attention, but more importantly, they happened outdoors, in the fresh, unfiltered air, and under natural sunlight, and this exposure to daylight, something we now call light therapy, is known to regulate the production of serotonin and melatonin, both of which directly influence our sleep-wake cycles. The typical Viking didn't sit for hours on end or stare into glowing rectangles. Their bodies were in motion, their eyes were adjusted to the hues of the sky and the reflection of the sea, and by the time the sun began its descent, fatigue was not something to be fought with caffeine or screens. It was welcomed as a sign that the day had been productive, and that night could begin without guilt or resistance, because in their world, sleep was part of the cycle of labor and recovery, necessary part of staying sharp and capable in an often harsh environment. Meals were shared communally, often at long wooden tables near the hearth, and though the food might seem simple by modern standards, stews, porridge, dried meat, flatbreads, boiled cabbage, the act of eating together reinforced social ties and allowed for stories to be told, plans to be made, and emotions to be processed, all of which reduced social isolation and promoted emotional security. And today, we know that feeling connected and supported is a major factor in regulating sleep hormones and decreasing stress-induced insomnia. And stress, of course, was a constant factor in early medieval life, from the threat of raids to harsh winters and unpredictable crops. But the way Viking communities handled stress was different from how we do today. There was less chronic low-level anxiety and more acute challenges that were handled through action, community, and resilience training from an early age, meaning that by the time people reached adulthood, their stress response was matched by a robust ability to recover, especially during rest periods, which again created the internal balance necessary for deep, regenerative sleep. Even the role of storytelling in the Viking world helped promote restfulness. As the sun disappeared and tasks ended for the day, family members gathered around the fire not for passive consumption of entertainment, but for active storytelling, where sagas and myths were shared aloud by those who remembered them best, often in rhythmic, poetic forms that lulled the listener into calmness and engaged the imagination in ways that promoted sleep, not because they were dull or boring, but because the brain, once satisfied by narrative, no longer sought stimulation and was free to drift gently into dreams. These stories were not merely distractions. They were cultural anchors, preserving shared values and identities, and they often dealt with heroic journeys, moral challenges, or the mysteries of the gods, which meant they touched both the emotional and the philosophical, satisfying a deeper part of the mind that modern entertainment often neglects, and this satisfaction may have played a role in lowering nighttime rumination, that cycle of overthinking which today is one of the primary reasons people lie awake. Because when the mind feels heard, fed, and connected, it does not need to stay alert. We also know that sleep schedules were not always rigid or uniform. While most people slept after sunset and rose with the light, there was a level of flexibility built into their routines, especially during winter months when nights stretched long, and it's likely that people took naps or breaks during the day when needed, a concept now referred to as polyphasic sleep, which some researchers argue is more natural to human biology than the strict 8-hour block we chase today. And in Viking life, this flexible approach meant that rest was taken when the body demanded it, not when the schedule allowed it. Importantly, this relationship with sleep extended even into the way Vikings thought about death. The idea of eternal rest was not something to be feared but accepted, even embraced, as seen in burial customs where the dead were placed with goods, tools, and even their bedding materials, as if to ensure that their rest continued beyond this life. And this symbolic continuity between sleep and death lent the act of sleeping a kind of sacred weight, a recognition that in sleep we briefly left the physical world and entered something deeper, unknown, and possibly divine. The placement of sleeping areas in the longhouse also reflected a kind of practical psychology. Parents often slept closest to the hearth, where it was warmest, while children and elders were positioned nearby for safety and access, and this created a natural sense of protection during the night, with the family forming a physical barrier between the outside world and the inner sanctum, which may have triggered the brain's security mechanisms and allowed for more stable sleep architecture, especially the deep sleep phases needed for physical recovery and immune function. Even their interaction with natural elements, the way they respected seasonal shifts, tracked moon phases, and celebrated solstices, reflected an intuitive understanding that time and energy flow in cycles, not straight lines, and this cyclical thinking encouraged a more fluid relationship with rest and wakefulness, one that didn't punish tiredness or glorify productivity but acknowledged that all living things have rhythms, and that ignoring those rhythms leads to exhaustion and imbalance, something modern society is only just beginning to rediscover through sleep science and circadian research. And perhaps most crucially of all, Viking sleep habits were not shaped by commerce. There were no industries profiting from keeping people awake longer, no marketing campaigns designed to sell energy drinks or sleep trackers, no screens engineered to steal attention and delay bedtime. Their lives were built around the land, the community, and the unspoken agreement that the body knew best when it was time to rest, and that by listening to that instinct, not fighting it, they preserved their strength, their sanity, and their stories for the generations that would follow. To fully grasp why Viking-age sleep may have been among the healthiest in history, we have to look beyond the home itself and into the landscape that surrounded it. A world of dense forests, vast fjords, deep snow, salty air, and constant shifts in daylight that shaped every aspect of daily life, including how and when people slept, and it was in this natural theater that the Norse people developed an intimate relationship with the rhythms of the planet, adapting their habits not to schedules written on paper but to the slow breathing of the earth, the tilt of the sun, and the return of darkness. In modern life, we chase light at all hours, we flip switches, charge phones, open laptops, and in doing so, we've created an artificial day that never ends. But the Vikings lived in a world where darkness was not a problem to be solved but a season to be respected, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the northernmost settlements of early Scandinavia, where winter nights could stretch endlessly, swallowing the horizon in shades of gray and black for weeks at a time, and yet rather than fighting these long nights, Viking communities embraced them, adjusting their activities, expectations, and most importantly, their sleep. During these extended winters, people often slept longer, not just because it was cold, but because the absence of light signaled their bodies to enter a kind of slow state. Energy was conserved, fires were lit earlier, and work shifted indoors, and even the social atmosphere became quieter and more introspective, as families huddled together, told stories, and let the darkness act as a cue to rest, reflect, and replenish. And this natural expansion of sleep during the darker months is something researchers now believe to be deeply embedded in human biology. Yet it's something modern life tends to override. And then, as the light returned in spring and exploded in the long days of summer, the pattern shifted again. Not because anyone enforced it, but because the light itself became an activator, keeping people outdoors longer, lengthening chores, expanding travel, and shifting the sleep schedule to accommodate the sudden abundance of activity. This wasn't insomnia, it was seasonal wakefulness, a balance that modern societies have nearly lost by forcing uniform schedules all year round, despite the body's internal need for seasonal variation. Light, especially natural light, is one of the most powerful regulators of circadian rhythm, and Viking life was steeped in it. The low golden sun of northern mornings, the pinkish haze of twilight over a frozen lake, even the flicker of firelight after dark. All of it created a visual language that the body learned to read intuitively, adjusting hormone levels and energy output without the need for clocks or alarms. And when the sun finally set behind the hills, it didn't just mark the end of labor, it signaled a transition from doing to resting, from speaking to listening, from the outer world to the inner. There was also a spiritual component to this relationship with light and dark. In Norse cosmology, light and darkness weren't merely opposites, but entities with their own power, mystery, and rhythm. The dawn was sacred, a time for the gods of clarity and protection, while the night was inhabited by dreams, omens, and unseen presences, and this worldview, deeply rooted in myth and oral tradition, encouraged a kind of respect for rest that is rarely found in modern productivity cultures, which often treat sleep as an inconvenience or weakness to be overcome. In this worldview, sleep wasn't empty. It was active in a different way, a time when the soul might travel, when messages might be received, when the world behind the eyes opened just as the outer world closed. And this idea gave even the most mundane act of lying down beneath a fur blanket a sense of meaning, of potential, of openness. And that belief, even without hard science, may have contributed to a deeper ability to let go of waking thought, to surrender to stillness, and to allow the body and mind to enter true sleep. Even the act of watching the sky, the stars, the moon, the drifting clouds, had its place in Viking life, particularly for those who worked at sea, and sailors, traders, and explorers learned to read the heavens not just for navigation but for timing, knowing when to rest based on celestial signs that had guided their ancestors for generations. And this constant observation of the sky reinforced the connection between humans and time as it was meant to be felt. Slow, turning, patient, and full of rhythm. Modern people spend the majority of their time indoors, beneath synthetic lights that confuse the pineal gland and suppress melatonin long into the night, making it harder to fall asleep and harder to stay asleep. But for the Vikings, who lived in close contact with real daylight and real night, the biological systems governing sleep had no interference. The brain received the right signals at the right times, and the body followed without resistance, without anxiety, without tossing and turning in a room full of electronics. Another overlooked factor is noise, or rather, the lack of man-made noise. And in the Viking countryside, especially in more remote settlements, the nighttime soundscape would have been made up of wind, rustling trees, distant animals, maybe water flowing through a stream or waves against a shore, all of which are now recreated artificially in sleep therapy environments because they encourage the parasympathetic nervous system to activate, slowing the heart, relaxing the muscles, and deepening respiration. And this is something Viking sleepers experienced every night, not through a machine but through the living world. The sounds of their lives followed the sun. Mornings filled with clanging tools and animal calls, afternoons echoing with hammers, footsteps, and human voices, and evenings that quieted as candles were extinguished, conversations tapered, and fire replaced speech. And this sonic tapering signaled the brain to begin its descent into rest, long before the act of lying down even occurred. And this natural reduction in noise may have reduced nighttime vigilance, a state in which the brain remains semi-alert to danger, which in modern settings is often triggered by the presence of artificial light and urban sounds even while we sleep. Of course, their lives were not stress-free. Winters could be brutal, food could run low, conflict could arrive without warning. But these stressors were intermittent, not constant, and they were often communal, meaning people faced them together, not alone, which reduced the burden on the individual mind and helped distribute emotional weight across the family or village. And this sense of shared responsibility, of knowing you were not the only one carrying the load, created an emotional environment that allowed people to rest more fully when the time came. Sleep was not just for recovery, it was for readiness. And the Viking way of living, which aligned the body with the seasons, the sun, the soil, and the sea, made that readiness possible not through discipline or technology, but through trust in the natural world's ability to guide, soothe, and restore. And that trust, perhaps more than any specific behavior or belief, may be the reason their sleep was so consistently deep, nourishing, and whole. While it might seem surprising today, the restful sleep enjoyed by Viking-age people was not simply a private comfort or nightly pause from labor. It was, in fact, a foundational part of their resilience, their ability to survive in a harsh and changing world, and even their capacity for long-range exploration, trade, and conquest, because sleep was not isolated from the rest of life. It was deeply embedded in the very structure of what made their culture so capable, mobile, and enduring. Across centuries, to row for hours across an open fjord in freezing rain, to chop down a dense pine forest and build a seaworthy ship by hand, to carry heavy tools through uneven mountain trails, or to engage in brutal combat. All of these required not just physical strength but mental clarity, reaction time, coordination, and emotional regulation, and these are all things modern science now confirms are directly tied to the quality of one's sleep. And yet the Vikings had no textbooks on REM cycles or sleep hygiene. They simply lived in a way that supported deep recovery night after night. Consider the nature of long-distance sea voyages, especially those undertaken by Norse explorers heading west toward Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the coast of North America. Such journeys demanded not only courage and navigation skill, but a level of physical endurance that could not have been sustained without consistent rest in the days and weeks leading up to departure. And we often forget that these voyages began not just with plans and preparations, but with sleep, with full nights of uninterrupted restoration that allowed the body and mind to perform when it mattered most. Even on the ships themselves, sleep was managed carefully. Though Viking longships did not have cabins in the modern sense, travelers took turns resting in rotation, often wrapped in cloaks beneath shields or tarps when possible, and the crew developed patterns of rest and alertness that allowed the vessel to keep moving while still giving each member a chance to recover. And this management of sleep during travel was not accidental. It was part of an oral tradition, a body of passed down knowledge about how to keep the body and mind strong. And while that wisdom may not have been written down, it was felt, observed, and repeated across generations. Back on land, survival through winter depended not only on stored food and warm shelter, but also on the ability to remain calm, resourceful, and adaptable, qualities that are deeply tied to brain function, especially during times of deprivation or threat. And modern sleep researchers now tell us that sleep deprivation weakens executive function, damages memory, increases impulsivity, and heightens emotional reactivity, all of which are liabilities in a world where a missed decision could lead to injury, starvation, or even death. And yet Viking communities, despite the dangers they faced, maintained enough collective stability to preserve complex crafts, oral literature, religious rites, and legal systems over many centuries. This is not a coincidence. It is the long-term result of a people who slept in alignment with the world they lived in, who gave their minds the space to consolidate memory, the time to resolve emotional stress, and the biological conditions needed to restore the immune system, repair tissue, and maintain mental clarity, all while viewing sleep not as lost time, but as a normal, valuable, and even sacred part of the human experience. There's also a deeper truth about how Vikings thought about energy. In their world, strength was not something you burned constantly until it was gone. It was something you protected, recharged, and used only when needed. And this wisdom is reflected in their sleep patterns, in the way they slowed down in winter, balanced effort with stillness, and taught children to listen to their bodies long before they taught them to fight or travel. In this way, rest was embedded into identity, not tacked on at the end of a long day like a reward, but carried forward as a foundation of endurance. Even the law codes and customs of Norse society show an understanding of pacing. The thing, or public assembly, did not last all day and night but followed a rhythm that allowed for decision-making, eating, storytelling, and yes, sleep, and festivals, while lively and rich with song and drink, were interspersed with rest periods, especially in the long celebrations of the winter solstice, when the return of the sun was welcomed slowly, with awareness of time's flow, not with frantic activity, but with patience, firelight, and rest. And when death came, it too was framed as a passage into sleep. Many burial mounds contain the dead lying on their side or back, surrounded by goods, cloaks, furs, sometimes even beds or bedding, and the symbolism is clear. The person was going to sleep in the other world, and the comfort of their rest would reflect the life they had lived. This ritual expression speaks volumes about how deeply rest was woven into every stage of existence, from infancy to the afterlife. There are also signs that Viking women, in particular, played an important role in managing the rest cycles of households, not only through preparing beds and weaving blankets, but through maintaining order in the evening routine, ensuring that food was consumed at regular times, that fires were tended properly, and that children were taught to wind down through song, story, and repetition. And this role, often understated in sagas, was a central part of how entire households maintained harmony and energy during the long months when life depended on cooperation, quiet, and consistent sleep. Sleep even entered the language of mythology. In Norse legend, the god Odin is said to have sacrificed one of his eyes in exchange for knowledge, but he also spent 9 nights hanging from the world tree Yggdrasil, in a kind of deathless trance between waking and sleep, gaining runes and hidden wisdom. And though this myth is often interpreted metaphorically, it reminds us that the boundary between sleep, insight, and transformation was thin in Viking culture, and that time spent in stillness was not wasted, but potentially revelatory. Modern life, by contrast, glorifies hustle. It tells us that staying up late is a badge of honor, that skipping rest is necessary for success. But Viking life shows us a different truth, one that feels ancient and yet urgently relevant. That in order to go far, you must first be still. In order to be strong, you must first recover. And in order to understand yourself, you must first sleep deeply, again and again, across the seasons, the years, and the stories we leave behind. There was something else that helped Viking people rest more deeply than many modern humans: the relationship between physical labor and earned rest. Every day in the Viking Age was filled with tasks that pushed the body, not just in battle or hunting, but in daily life: hauling firewood from the forest, cutting peat for the hearth, weaving sails from thick wool, boiling and dyeing fabrics, and rowing boats across vast stretches of sea. The kind of exhaustion they experienced wasn't the jittery fatigue from staring at a screen all day. It was the kind of deep, grounding tiredness that came from using every part of the body purposefully. This physical lifestyle triggered a very natural cycle. By the time dusk fell, there was little left to do but wind down, especially during the long winters when the sun barely rose. Their circadian rhythms, unlike ours today, weren't disrupted by late-night screens, bright LED lights, or 24-hour entertainment. Instead, their internal clocks were synchronized with the sun, the moon, and the rhythms of nature. Darkness came early, and with it, quiet. Even in large settlements like Hedeby or Jorvik, night was not a time for activity. Aside from the occasional watchman or the cries of distant animals, the world fell still. In this silence, in this natural dark, the mind and body were free to surrender. They weren't resisting sleep, they were moving into it the same way they moved through the sea or the forest, patiently, steadily, naturally. It's important to understand how few distractions they had compared to us. A Viking farmer didn't lie in bed scrolling through news or social media. He didn't wonder if he'd forgotten to reply to a dozen emails or if he was missing out on some online event. There were no streetlights to glow under the curtains, no buzzing of distant cars. When he lay down, there was nothing to delay the descent into sleep. It was a clean break between day and night, a deliberate, restful boundary that we've blurred in modern times. Another key part of Viking rest was the structure of their day. It wasn't just dawn to dusk labor. They had pauses, seasonal pauses, festive pauses. During the dark winter months, for example, activity slowed dramatically. Fields couldn't be worked. Journeys became dangerous. Communities turned inward. They gathered inside their longhouses for storytelling, singing, crafting, and shared meals. This slowing down, this return to the hearth, helped reset the nervous system. While modern life accelerates year-round with barely a pause for breath, the Vikings lived by the tempo of the seasons. And then, there was the role of storytelling. Before sleep, many Viking families told tales of gods, of ancestors, of strange beasts in distant lands. These stories weren't just for entertainment. They were a bridge between the waking world and the dream world. Listening to a voice telling an old tale by the fire, while lying under a fur blanket, was a comforting, grounding ritual. It activated the imagination while simultaneously calming the senses. Storytelling was, in many ways, their version of guided meditation. The story soothed the mind, creating dreamlike images, gently pulling listeners into sleep. Imagine being a child in a Viking longhouse. Outside, a storm rattles the thatched roof. Inside, the fire crackles. Your mother or grandfather's voice floats through the dark, telling you about Thor's hammer or a long ship voyage beyond the horizon. You can smell the wool of the blankets, feel the presence of the family around you, and the warmth of the fire. You don't even realize when the story ends, because you've already drifted off. This practice of communal, oral bedtime stories was almost universal. There were no books, no podcasts, no white noise apps. Just human voices in a quiet room, surrounded by the dark, recounting memories and myths. It created a strong mental habit. Night was for rest, for stories, for dreams. Today, sleep researchers talk about sleep hygiene, rituals and habits that make good rest more likely. The Vikings may not have had a term for it, but they practiced it with instinctive precision. No caffeine, no screens, no ambient noise, no artificial lights. They relied on firelight, community, physical tiredness, and the comfort of repetition. Over time, this created a deep association between the evening hours and true, restorative rest. There's even evidence that Vikings practiced segmented sleep, which was common in pre-industrial societies. They might go to sleep shortly after nightfall, sleep for a few hours, then wake during a peaceful watch period in the middle of the night. During this time, they might pray, talk quietly, mend clothes, or simply lie in the dark, letting thoughts drift. Then they would return to sleep for a second phase until dawn. This rhythm, broken into two natural segments, has been found to improve memory, reduce anxiety, and increase the vividness of dreams. Far from being sleep-deprived warriors constantly in battle, the truth is, Viking people may have had one of the most balanced, restorative relationships with sleep in human history. They trusted the rhythms of the world, the patterns of nature, and the calming rituals of home life. In doing so, they created conditions where sleep wasn't a struggle. It was a gift, welcomed every night with full presence. But beyond the practical and environmental conditions that allowed Vikings to rest well, there's something else to consider: how they viewed dreams. In the Viking world, dreams were never just random flickers of the subconscious. They were messages, symbols, omens. People believed dreams could predict battles, offer warnings from the gods, or even guide a person's path in life. This deeply spiritual and cultural significance gave dreaming a revered place in Norse society, turning sleep itself into something more than rest. It became a sacred bridge between the living world and the unknown. Viking sagas often speak of powerful dreams, not just from kings and warriors, but from everyday people. For example, in the Laxdæla saga, a woman named Gurn dreams of 4 men, each one symbolizing a future husband. Her dreams carry weight and meaning, and as the saga unfolds, each one proves prophetic. These stories weren't considered fiction. To the Norse mind, they were accurate depictions of how the world worked. A dream could shape decisions, shift power, and change the course of a family's future. And so, falling asleep wasn't just about recovery from labor. It was a sacred act, full of possibility. This reverence for sleep and dreams likely helped Vikings approach bedtime with peace rather than anxiety. Where modern people often lie awake worrying about emails or social obligations, Vikings lay down expecting something profound, even divine. Sleep was never a waste of time. It was a necessary, honored part of life. Their mythology reflects this as well. The god Odin, who ruled over wisdom and war, also had deep ties to sleep and visions. He would go into deep trances, sacrificing sight or comfort to gain knowledge, sometimes while appearing to sleep. His journeys through dreamlike states reinforced the idea that rest could bring revelation. The god of dreams, Morpheus, from later Greco-Roman influence, didn't exist in Norse myths, but their culture was just as consumed with the mystery of the night. These beliefs also influenced how they treated the elderly. Older members of Viking society were respected, not dismissed. Their dreams were considered wise, their rest earned. This respect extended into the rituals surrounding death. A person laid to rest in a burial mound was often positioned as if peacefully sleeping, surrounded by personal items and tools they might need in the afterlife. Death, in a way, was viewed as the longest sleep of all. This belief in the sacredness of sleep even reached children. Young ones weren't left to cry in solitude. Mothers would sing ancient lullabies, called Vagjavisar, filled with stories of gods, fjords, and fates. These songs weren't just soothing, they were educational. They connected children to their heritage while guiding them into calm, meaningful sleep. Some of these lullabies survived, passed down orally through generations, and are still known in Icelandic or Old Norse form today. Of course, not every night was filled with gentle dreams and peaceful snoozing. The Viking world had its terrors: wolves in the woods, enemy raids, or harsh storms. But even in these moments, they had customs that promoted rest. Families gathered tightly in longhouses for warmth and protection. They took turns keeping watch when traveling. And for every danger outside, there were stories, charms, and rituals meant to keep fear at bay. One such ritual was the use of runes, those mysterious carved symbols often found on stones and artifacts. Vikings believed certain runes held protective power. Some would carve these symbols into wooden pieces and place them near their bedding or around their sleeping quarters. Others would whisper protective chants, part prayer, part poem, believed to calm the spirit and guard the soul as it drifted into slumber. When we look at this from a modern lens, it becomes clear Vikings embedded sleep deeply into the structure of their world. It wasn't merely a routine. It was an essential connection to their gods, their ancestors, and their identity. They didn't just sleep better because of the climate or their diet. They slept better because they believed in sleep. And that belief, powerful as it was, made all the difference. Their homes, though simple, were designed with an understanding of the elements that would put modern minimalists to shame. Viking longhouses were long, rectangular wooden structures with thick, turf-covered roofs. These roofs acted like natural insulation, trapping heat in the winter and keeping the air cool during summer nights. The walls were made of wattle and daub or stacked timber, offering durability and resistance to the bitter winds that swept across Scandinavia. Inside, the family slept around a central hearth, the glowing embers of the fire casting soft flickers against the low ceiling. The smoke from the fire escaped through a hole in the roof, but much of its warmth remained within, making the space cozy and still. There were no streetlights outside, no buzzing of electronics, no engines growling in the night, just the crackle of fire, the rustle of wool blankets, and the distant howl of wind across the fjords. People fell asleep to the sounds of nature, and their bodies responded to the rhythm of light and dark. As the sun disappeared for hours on end during the long winters, people entered deeper cycles of rest. They weren't forced to fight their body clocks to meet modern schedules. When night came, it was truly dark, and when it was dark, they slept. Sleep was also a necessity. Life in Viking times was brutally physical. They farmed, chopped wood, hauled water, and often traveled long distances by foot or by sea. By the time the fire died down, their bodies craved sleep, not out of leisure, but because every part of their day demanded energy. Unlike today, there was no separation between exercise and daily living. The movement of the day fed directly into the quality of their night. And because they had no exposure to artificial blue light, melatonin production wasn't disrupted. Their brains knew when it was time to rest, and they obeyed without resistance. Interestingly, many Viking Age people followed what scientists now call segmented sleep. This meant they didn't sleep in one solid block as most modern people attempt to. Instead, they often slept in two main phases, divided by a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. This in-between time was used for prayer, reflection, or even short tasks by the fire. There was no rush. The night was long, and sleep was not a race. It was a process respected and allowed to unfold naturally. This segmented pattern was likely encouraged by the long hours of darkness, especially in the winter months. The body would rest for a few hours, awaken calmly, and then drift off again. There was no frustration over sleeplessness because it was expected. The anxiety that many people today feel when waking at night simply didn't exist. Waking wasn't a problem, it was part of the cycle. Imagine a world where waking up at 2 a.m. didn't bring stress, but instead a moment of peace, reflection, or quiet time with loved ones. Even the beds, though primitive by modern standards, had their own comforting charm. People slept on raised wooden platforms covered in straw or furs. Some households lined these areas with woolen blankets or animal skins for warmth. They weren't concerned with thread counts or memory foam. What mattered was staying warm and sleeping near the fire. Being close together in the same room also meant shared body heat, which made the night more comfortable. Privacy, as we know it, wasn't a priority. Rest and survival were. And then there's the matter of diet. The Viking diet was seasonal, rich in whole grains, root vegetables, fermented foods, fish, and meat. They ate what they grew, caught, or raised. There were no artificial preservatives or chemicals. No sugar-laden drinks or midnight snacks disrupting insulin levels. Their meals were hearty, nutritious, and spaced out across the day, typically ending with a filling dinner in the early evening. This allowed the digestive system to settle before bed, leading to deeper and more restorative sleep. Add to this the mental state of Viking Age people. Despite the hardships of the time, wars, disease, and the daily struggle to survive, there was a kind of mental stillness that modern society struggles to find. They didn't scroll through news feeds or doom scroll into the early hours. They weren't bombarded with flashing images, messages, or endless alerts. Their minds were rooted in the present moment, in the rhythms of their village, their animals, and the land around them. This presence, this lack of overstimulation, naturally led to a state of calm before bed. It's no wonder, then, that when they laid down, exhausted, full, warm, and connected to the cycles of nature. They likely experienced some of the deepest, most unbroken sleep in human history. They didn't need sleep aids, meditation apps, or blackout curtains. Their entire life was aligned with rest. And their bodies, minds, and spirits were allowed to drift into the quiet dark, without resistance, without distraction. But there's still more to uncover about how this ancient sleep pattern may offer lessons for us today. Even in the coldest parts of Scandinavia, the Viking people didn't dread bedtime. They embraced it as a sacred daily ritual. Their deep connection with the natural world meant that their sleep cycles aligned closely with the rhythms of the earth, especially during the long, dark winters. Without electric lights, screens, or artificial noise, their circadian rhythms remained undisturbed. They woke when the sky lit faintly with the rising sun and settled into rest as twilight faded into night, often sleeping for a full 8 to 10 hours without interruption. Their homes, typically longhouses made of wood, turf, or stone depending on the region, were designed to insulate and retain heat efficiently. Inside, beds were usually built along the walls, filled with straw, feathers, or soft mosses, and covered in thick woolen blankets or animal hides. Even in communities with many members living under one roof, a surprising level of sleep quality was maintained. Families often slept near the hearth, the central fire of the home, which radiated a gentle warmth through the night and added a soothing crackling background sound, much like the ambient noise people today use for sleep apps or white noise machines. Children, elders, and adults alike were accustomed to sleeping in closer proximity than we might expect today, which added an extra layer of warmth in the winter months. This communal sleep, rather than disturbing rest, often enhanced feelings of safety and comfort. And interestingly, dreams were often considered messages from the divine or the ancestors. So sleep wasn't just about recovery. It was also viewed as a bridge between the physical world and the spiritual realm. Before bed, it was common for families to spend time together in low light, sharing oral stories, riddles, or even simple songs. These nightly traditions served a similar purpose to today's wind-down routines, gradually lowering the energy of the household. Without artificial light sources disrupting melatonin production, Viking individuals fell asleep more easily and deeply than most people do today. There's also archaeological evidence suggesting that Vikings had a surprisingly refined relationship with the substances that aided sleep. Valerian root, for example, a herb still used today for its calming properties, was known in Northern Europe. Though we can't say with complete certainty how often it was used for sleep, its presence among grave goods and domestic remains indicates that they may have relied on natural remedies for relaxation and rest. Moreover, Viking societies embraced a seasonal pattern of activity that modern people are often disconnected from. The darker months were times of rest, reflection, and lower productivity. Unlike today's world, which demands consistency year-round, the Vikings accepted that sleep and energy varied with the environment. During the harshest months, activity slowed significantly, and people spent more time indoors, often engaging in craftwork or storytelling during daylight, and conserving energy during the extended nights. Their diets may have also contributed to better sleep. Rich in omega-3 fatty acids from fish, dense grains, berries, root vegetables, and fermented foods, their nutrition supported stable blood sugar and provided essential nutrients for brain health. In turn, this could have promoted a more balanced mood and deeper rest. Food was often eaten communally and slowly, without the distraction of rushing or technology, giving the body time to process and prepare for rest. It's worth noting that while Viking life could be violent and physically demanding, daily routines also included ample time outdoors, especially for farming, fishing, or sailing. Exposure to daylight and physical exertion helped regulate the body's natural rhythms. By the time evening came, fatigue was physical and earned, and the transition to sleep was smoother and more complete than it often is for people today. There's a paradox here that modern researchers find compelling. Despite lacking our medical understanding of sleep hygiene, the Vikings naturally practiced many of the principles we now recognize as best for sleep. Darkness, cold temperatures, natural bedding, physical activity, limited stimulation before bed, herbal remedies, and a deep cultural respect for rest. All these created ideal conditions for sleep quality. Even in the context of their warrior culture, sleep was not seen as a weakness. On the contrary, it was a strength, a tool for recovery and spiritual insight. Dream interpretation was sometimes done by seers or elders, who believed that what happened in sleep had consequences in waking life. Dreams might even be shared in the morning over the first meal, passed down and remembered for generations. As we examine the fragments of Viking life through archaeology, sagas, and historical accounts, we're not just uncovering what they built or conquered. We're also piecing together the texture of their inner worlds. The quiet hours when the swords were set aside, when firelight danced across the timber walls, and when rest brought dreams filled with omens, memories, or distant gods. And it's in those moments, lying under thick woolen blankets, listening to the hush of snow outside or the wind across the fjord, that the Viking people likely found one of the purest forms of sleep in human history, untainted by the artificial, shaped by nature, and held sacred by their culture. By now, it should be clear that the Viking world was not just about war, conquest, and raiding. It was also a society that deeply valued balance, order, and rest. The patterns of the day, shaped by the rising and setting sun, by the rhythm of seasons, and by the communal pulse of daily tasks, were designed to support the human need for recovery. And this natural harmony extended even further into the very materials they surrounded themselves with at night. The Vikings understood something modern people often forget: the elements of your sleeping space matter. In a world without synthetic fibers or chemical treatments, everything in their environment was raw, natural, and breathable. Beds were not just piles of straw. Archaeological findings suggest that wealthier families often filled mattresses with soft feathers or down from ducks, geese, or eider. These materials not only provided comfort but also insulation, keeping people warm through long Scandinavian winters. The poor didn't enjoy the same luxury, but even they had access to materials like moss, dry grass, or wool shorn from their own sheep. Wool, as a fabric, breathes well and insulates even when damp, making it ideal for blankets and bedclothes. And perhaps more importantly, it's quiet. No synthetic rustling, no crackling sheets, just the soft, dense silence of natural materials pressed together in a darkened room. And speaking of darkness, few people today ever experience true blackness the way Viking Age Scandinavians did. In the absence of streetlights, illuminated screens, or city glow, nightfall brought a deep and unbroken dark that began shortly after sunset and endured for many hours. The body, cued by this enveloping shadow, responded as it had evolved to, by producing melatonin, by growing heavy with sleep, and by settling into deeper, more restorative stages of rest. In winter, the darkness stretched out for nearly 20 hours in the far north. Though modern minds may find this daunting, for Vikings, it was simply a seasonal shift in life. The extended night became a time for indoor work, storytelling, quiet reflection, and long, uninterrupted sleep. There was no pressure to be constantly productive. There was no shame in early bedtimes or midday naps. In fact, many Viking communities followed a biphasic sleep pattern, sleeping in two distinct segments of the night, broken by a period of wakeful quiet. This first segment, sometimes called first sleep, began shortly after dusk and lasted until around midnight. Then, people would wake gently, often without alarm or urgency, and spend an hour or two in a kind of peaceful interlude. They might stoke the hearth, pray, talk softly with others, or simply sit in silence. Then, without resistance, they would return to bed for their second sleep, which continued until dawn. Studies in the modern era have shown that when people are removed from artificial light and allowed to sleep naturally, many revert to this same biphasic rhythm. It appears to be biologically ingrained. The Vikings didn't need sleep studies to tell them what their bodies already knew. And it wasn't just what happened at night, it was how the day supported the night. Physical labor, exposure to sunlight, communal meals, and the total absence of screens or constant noise. All of it helped Vikings enter the night with a kind of readiness that modern humans often lack. They didn't lie awake scrolling. They didn't battle insomnia brought on by overstimulation. They worked, ate, talked, sat by the fire, and then, when it was time, they let the dark pull them under. There's something ancient in this rhythm, something lost but not forgotten. And the closer we look at the habits and homes of Viking people, the more we understand that sleep was not an inconvenience to be squeezed between waking hours. It was a cornerstone of life, essential, honored, and protected. It was not sacrificed for ambition or dulled by distraction. It was given space, respect, and time. And perhaps that is the real secret of why Viking sleep might have been the deepest and most peaceful in human history. But we're not done yet. The Viking approach to rest extended beyond the individual. Their architecture, their beliefs, and even their burial practices all reveal a society that intertwines sleep with meaning. Next, we'll explore the design of Viking homes, the way longhouses shaped not just how people lived, but how they slept. We'll look at warmth, quiet, and community, and how even in crowded spaces, the Viking world found ways to honor the human need for deep, undisturbed slumber. The Viking longhouse was more than just a shelter. It was a microcosm of Viking life and a sanctuary for rest. These long, rectangular buildings varied in size but typically measured between 15 to 30 meters in length and 5 to 7 meters wide. Constructed from timber frames, filled in with wattle and daub, and topped with thick turf roofs, they were surprisingly well insulated against the biting cold of northern winters. The earth itself played a role in maintaining warmth, as many longhouses were partially dug into the ground or built on stone foundations, creating a natural buffer against harsh winds. Inside, the longhouse was arranged with a focus on communal living and efficient use of space. The central hearth was the heart of the home, providing warmth and light during the long, dark hours. Around it, families cooked meals, mended tools, told stories, and shared the day's events. Yet, despite the proximity of daily activity, areas for rest were carefully designated, often along the walls where raised wooden platforms served as beds. These were layered with straw, furs, and woolen blankets to provide insulation and softness. The architecture of the longhouse minimized drafts and muffled external noise, creating a calm environment conducive to sleep. Windows were few and small, reducing cold air infiltration and blocking out the occasional glare of the moon or northern lights. Instead, light came primarily from the fire and oil lamps, both of which flickered gently and cast soft shadows, far from the harsh blue glow of modern LEDs. This low, warm lighting was ideal for signaling to the body that night was near, supporting the natural production of melatonin, the hormone responsible for regulating sleep cycles. The absence of artificial light pollution allowed the Vikings to maintain a strong connection to the natural cycles of day and night. As dusk fell, the gradual dimming of firelight helped their eyes and minds prepare for rest, unlike modern abrupt blackouts or screen-induced stimulation. Despite the longhouse often housing multiple family members or even extended kin, privacy was not the goal. Instead, the design fostered a sense of communal safety and warmth. Sleeping near others generated shared body heat, a critical factor in keeping warm through cold nights, and provided a natural sense of security that likely reduced stress and improved sleep quality. The feeling of belonging and protection cannot be overstated in its importance for deep rest, especially in a time when external dangers were more immediate. Moreover, the Viking sleeping arrangement wasn't rigid. During harsh winters or dangerous times, families might cluster closer together, sometimes sharing bedding or sleeping side by side to conserve warmth. In contrast, during warmer seasons, the arrangement might loosen, with individuals spreading out or even sleeping outside under the stars when conditions permitted. This flexibility underscored an adaptive approach to rest that respected both physical needs and environmental changes. The longhouse's design also included separate spaces for animals, typically at one end of the building. This proximity meant that livestock body heat further warmed the living quarters and created a buffer against the chill. Though this might seem uncomfortable by today's standards, it was a practical solution that contributed to a stable, warm sleeping environment, especially during brutal winters. In addition to architecture, Vikings practiced customs that enhanced rest. For example, it was customary to remove shoes and outer garments before entering the sleeping area to keep bedding clean and dry, while socks and layers helped maintain body heat, and furs provided a soft, breathable layer that insulated without overheating. Such practices minimized discomfort and disturbances during the night. Perhaps most importantly, the environment inside the longhouse encouraged a gradual transition from the bustle of day to the calm of night. As fires dimmed, voices lowered, and children were tucked in with songs or stories, a rhythm unfolded that made falling asleep a natural and welcomed process. There were no screens to fight or caffeine to overcome, just the gentle embrace of darkness, warmth, and kinship. In this way, the Viking longhouse was more than just a structure. It was a living system designed around human needs, deeply attuned to the demands of the northern climate and the rhythms of nature. It provided a refuge where sleep could be deep, uninterrupted, and restorative, conditions many modern sleepers yearn for but seldom find. Sleep was deeply woven into the very fabric of Viking culture, influencing everything from daily routines to their spiritual beliefs. The awareness that rest was essential for survival was not limited to individual households but extended into the social fabric of Viking communities. In gatherings, festivals, and legal assemblies known as things, rest and moderation were respected virtues rather than afterthoughts. Even the intense celebrations during Yule, the midwinter festival, were tempered by the acceptance that exhaustion and quiet moments were inevitable and necessary. The Yule period, which lasted for several days around the winter solstice, was a time of feasting, storytelling, and ritual, yet it was balanced by the long, dark nights that invited sleep and reflection. Families would gather to share food and tales of gods and heroes, creating a communal atmosphere that was warm and protective. After the festivities, people would return to their beds, ready to embrace the long hours of darkness that followed. The cultural emphasis on balance between activity and rest helped prevent burnout and encouraged resilience through the coldest, most challenging months. Furthermore, Vikings practiced a respect for the body that informed their approach to work and rest. The idea of working hard, resting well was not a slogan but a lived reality. Physical toil was intense and necessary, but it was matched by deliberate periods of recuperation. Warriors knew that exhaustion could be fatal in battle, so recovery was prioritized whenever possible. This balance contributed to their famed endurance, agility, and mental sharpness, qualities that made them formidable both in combat and in their daily lives. Sleep, then, was not viewed as passive or weak but as a vital source of strength and preparation. This mindset contrasted sharply with modern attitudes that often treat sleep as a luxury or an obstacle to productivity. The Vikings' holistic integration of rest into their lives meant that their nights were as important as their days, and their cultural stories, rituals, and routines reinforced this value continually. The influence of nature was paramount. Vikings did not fight against the changing light. Instead, they adapted to it. In summer, when daylight stretched for nearly 20 hours in some northern regions, activity increased, but they still sought to honor the need for rest during the brief darkness. Conversely, winter's long nights invited slower rhythms, reflective thought, and extended sleep. This seasonal variation was not a problem but a rhythm that shaped their entire existence. From farming schedules to travel plans, from hunting expeditions to the telling of ancient sagas by firelight. Even the way Vikings approached illness showed an understanding of the healing power of sleep. When sick or injured, they often rested extensively, recognizing that sleep was a crucial part of the body's recovery process. This contrasted with some other ancient cultures that sometimes prized stoicism over rest, potentially prolonging illness. For Vikings, recuperation was necessary, respected, and facilitated by family care and the comforting environment of the home. The presence of the family unit during sleep also played a crucial role in psychological well-being. Sharing space with kin provided a sense of security and belonging, reducing stress and fostering emotional calm. In times of danger, whether from raids, wild animals, or harsh weather, this close proximity created a protective environment that allowed individuals to sleep more soundly than they might have otherwise. Sleep was further embedded in Viking spirituality. Dreams were taken seriously, interpreted as messages from the gods or ancestors, and often recounted in the morning to provide guidance. This practice underscored the belief that rest was not just physical restoration but also a time of spiritual communication and insight. The sacredness of sleep was reflected in burial customs as well, where the dead were laid to rest as if merely sleeping, surrounded by possessions for the journey beyond. Through all these aspects, architecture, daily routines, social customs, spiritual beliefs, and seasonal rhythms, Vikings crafted a life in which sleep was respected and integrated. It was neither rushed nor undervalued, but given space and honor as a fundamental human need. This holistic approach allowed them to thrive in a challenging environment, maintaining health, strength, and clarity. Understanding the Viking approach to sleep offers not only historical insight but also a reminder of how deeply connected rest is to the rhythms of nature and community. Their lives invite us to reconsider our own relationship with sleep, to honor it as an essential, restorative part of existence, and to seek balance amid the pressures of modern life. As we explore further, it becomes clear that the Vikings' relationship with sleep extended beyond the home and individual habits. It was also reflected in their healing practices and medicinal knowledge. While modern medicine was non-existent, the Vikings had a practical understanding of herbs and natural remedies that supported restful sleep and recovery. Archaeological finds, including ancient burial sites and settlements, reveal the presence of plants like valerian root, chamomile, and hops, all known today for their calming and sleep-inducing properties. Valerian root, in particular, has been used for centuries across Europe for its sedative effects. Though we cannot be certain of the exact extent to which Vikings employed such remedies, the presence of these herbs in domestic contexts suggests they valued natural ways to ease the body and mind into restful states. These plants might have been brewed into teas or infused into oils applied during the evening, helping to soothe muscle aches from hard labor and calm restless minds. Beyond herbal aids, Vikings likely practiced simple hygiene rituals that contributed to better sleep quality. For example, it is believed that they bathed regularly in natural hot springs or cold rivers, depending on the season. The act of bathing would relax muscles and help regulate body temperature, both crucial factors for falling asleep easily. Bathing was also a social and ritual activity, strengthening community bonds and providing psychological comfort. Temperature regulation played an important role in Viking sleep. Their homes, while insulated, were still subject to the cold of Scandinavian winters. To counter this, thick furs, wool blankets, and layered clothing were standard, enabling individuals to stay warm without overheating. This balance is vital because both cold and heat extremes can disrupt sleep cycles. The Vikings' use of natural materials that allowed the skin to breathe while providing warmth was a form of passive temperature control far more sophisticated than might be expected. The Viking diet, rich in omega-3 fatty acids from fish, fermented foods, root vegetables, and whole grains, further supported their sleep health. Nutrients like magnesium, vitamin B6, and tryptophan, all present in their traditional diet, are now recognized as contributors to better sleep regulation. Eating patterns typically involved a large midday meal and a lighter dinner earlier in the evening, allowing digestion to progress before bedtime, a factor that prevents discomfort and promotes deeper sleep stages. Mental health and emotional well-being were also tied closely to sleep quality. The Vikings, like many ancient peoples, valued community and social cohesion highly. Their practices of storytelling, singing, and shared rituals before sleep reinforced social bonds and provided emotional support. These acts reduced anxiety and fostered a sense of safety, essential components for restful sleep. In the harsh and unpredictable world of the Viking Age, uncertainty and danger were constants. But by establishing reliable routines around rest and recovery, Vikings created pockets of stability and peace. Sleep became a sanctuary, a place to recover strength, process experiences, and connect to the unseen spiritual world through dreams. Interestingly, some sagas describe warriors who would sleep lightly or remain half awake in anticipation of danger. This warrior sleep reflects an adaptive balance between rest and alertness, shaped by the demands of their environment. Yet even these heightened states did not prevent restorative sleep altogether. Instead, they illustrate the Vikings' deep attunement to their surroundings and their body's needs. All these factors combined suggest that Viking sleep was not accidental but cultivated, an integral part of survival, health, and cultural identity. While modern lifestyles often prioritize productivity over rest, The Vikings demonstrate how honoring sleep fosters resilience, clarity, and strength. As we continue to delve into this ancient way of life, the lessons of Viking sleep resonate strongly today. In a world of constant stimulation and relentless pace, their example invites us to slow down, respect our natural rhythms, and reclaim the restorative power of true rest. The more we examine the Viking approach to rest, the clearer it becomes that their entire lifestyle was crafted around natural rhythms and a profound respect for the body's needs. While modern life bombards us with artificial lights, endless noise, and a non-stop pace, the Vikings lived in harmony with the world around them. Their lives were shaped by the sun, the seasons, and the quiet passage of time, factors that made deep, restorative sleep not just possible, but inevitable. An important aspect of Viking sleep was their seasonal adaptation. In the summer months, when the sun barely set in northern regions, the extended daylight hours meant longer periods of activity. Yet, even then, the Vikings knew how to honor rest. They sought darkness whenever possible, using thick curtains made from heavy wool or hides to block out light in sleeping areas. This allowed them to preserve a natural sleep environment despite the lingering glow of midnight sun. Conversely, in the winter, long nights became a time for slowing down and renewal. Activity reduced significantly, and the longhouse became a refuge from the harsh cold. The dark, quiet hours encouraged not just sleep, but reflection, storytelling, and social bonding. This seasonal ebb and flow ensured that the Vikings maintained balance throughout the year, allowing their bodies and minds to recover fully from the physical demands of their lifestyle. Social customs reinforced these patterns. For example, the evening meal was often a communal event that transitioned naturally into rest. After dinner, families would gather around the hearth, sharing stories from the day or ancient sagas passed down through generations. These shared moments served as a gentle wind down, a time when voices lowered and the firelight flickered softly. This ritual eased the mind, helped emotions settle, and prepared the household for sleep. This cultural practice of storytelling was more than entertainment. It was a form of meditation and connection. Listening to tales of gods, heroes, and the natural world helped the Vikings process their own experiences, fears, and hopes. These narratives, rich in symbolism and moral lessons, resonated deeply, creating a psychological safety net that supported restful sleep. Furthermore, the sense of community extended into the physical space of sleep. Unlike today's emphasis on privacy and separate bedrooms, Viking families often shared sleeping spaces. This closeness provided warmth, security, and a feeling of belonging, factors known to enhance sleep quality. Being surrounded by trusted family members reduced stress and fostered calm, making it easier to fall and stay asleep. The Vikings also respected the idea that rest was a form of strength, not weakness. Warriors were encouraged to sleep well to maintain peak condition, knowing that exhaustion could be fatal in battle. This respect for sleep as vital to survival permeated their worldview, shaping attitudes that modern cultures might do well to emulate. Interestingly, the Viking approach to sleep is supported by modern science. Research now confirms that exposure to natural light and darkness, regular physical activity, social connection, and stress reduction are all critical components of healthy sleep. The Vikings, through necessity and intuition, embodied these principles centuries before sleep science existed. As we reflect on their way of life, it becomes evident that their success and resilience were closely tied to their patterns of rest. The ability to sleep deeply, recover fully, and engage with the world with clarity and strength was not accidental but cultivated through environment, culture, and belief. This ancient wisdom offers a powerful lesson. In a world increasingly disconnected from natural cycles and communal living, reclaiming respect for sleep may be one of the most profound ways to enhance our well-being. One aspect of Viking life that further contributed to their quality of sleep was their physical environment beyond the longhouse, the natural world surrounding them. Unlike today's urban jungles, Viking settlements were nestled amidst forests, fjords, and open fields. The sounds that filled their nights were natural and familiar. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of owls or wolves, the gentle lapping of water against a shoreline. These organic soundscapes created a calming atmosphere that promoted relaxation and rest. Modern research supports the benefits of natural sounds on sleep quality. The consistent, soothing rhythms of nature help lower heart rates, reduce stress hormones, and synchronize brainwaves. In contrast, the cacophony of city noises, sirens, traffic, constant chatter, often fragments sleep and increases awakenings. For the Vikings, the night was a time to reconnect with the wilderness, allowing their minds to enter peaceful states unperturbed by artificial disruptions. The clean, fresh air of the Nordic environment also played a vital role. Without pollution or enclosed, recycled air, the Vikings breathed deeply even while sleeping. Good air quality supports oxygen exchange and respiratory health, both critical for uninterrupted sleep cycles. The presence of herbs and plants in and around their homes might have contributed subtle aromatherapeutic effects as well. Scents of pine, juniper, or lavender, common in Nordic flora, have calming properties known to aid sleep and reduce anxiety. Additionally, the Vikings' lifestyle encouraged physical exertion from dawn till dusk. Farming, hunting, fishing, and crafting demanded strength, endurance, and stamina. This constant activity ensured that their bodies produced the natural fatigue necessary to fall asleep quickly and sleep deeply. Unlike modern sedentary lifestyles that often result in restlessness or insomnia, the Vikings' movement was purposeful and sustained. Their diets, as mentioned before, supported this physical lifestyle. Rich in proteins and nutrients necessary for muscle repair and energy, the food they consumed fueled their days and primed their nights for recovery. The absence of caffeine, sugar-laden snacks, or stimulants meant their nervous systems were not overloaded, allowing for a natural, gradual winding down. Beyond the physical, the Vikings' connection to spirituality and ritual further enhanced their approach to rest. Sleep and dreams were seen as portals to other realms, times when the soul journeyed beyond the physical world. This belief imbued sleep with sacredness, turning it into a revered practice rather than a mundane necessity. The rituals surrounding sleep, whether storytelling, chanting, or the placement of protective runes, created a sense of safety and calm that eased anxieties. By framing sleep as a transition into a spiritual experience, Vikings approached bedtime with anticipation and respect. This positive mindset is key even in modern sleep science, where cognitive behavioral therapy recognizes the power of mindset in overcoming insomnia. Moreover, the communal aspect of Viking society meant that social stressors were often mitigated through shared responsibility and support. Unlike today's isolated lifestyles, their close-knit communities provided emotional security. This environment decreased chronic stress, which modern science identifies as a major disruptor of sleep. In sum, the Vikings' superior sleep quality was no accident. It was the result of a lifestyle harmonized with nature's cycles, a culture that honored rest, an environment conducive to calm, and a spiritual framework that gave sleep profound meaning. Their experience challenges modern assumptions about productivity, rest, and health, inviting us to reconsider how we live and sleep. As we look ahead, perhaps the greatest gift the Vikings offer us is the reminder that sleep is not a luxury, but a foundation of life itself, one best nurtured by simplicity, community, and reverence for the natural world. One fascinating aspect of Viking sleep that historians and archaeologists have uncovered lies in their burial customs, which offer profound insights into how they perceived rest not just in life, but in death. Viking graves often depict the deceased laid as if simply sleeping, peacefully arranged on beds or platforms within burial mounds or ship burials. This positioning wasn't accidental. It reflected a cultural belief that death was a kind of final sleep, a transition rather than an end. The objects buried with the dead, swords, tools, jewelry, even food and drink, suggest the Vikings believed the journey beyond required preparation akin to a waking life. The bed itself was a symbol of rest and renewal, extending the importance of sleep beyond the living world. This respect for rest as a sacred state shows how deeply sleep was woven into their worldview, seen as a continuation of the soul's journey rather than a mere biological function. Viking sagas and oral traditions reinforce this spiritual connection to sleep. Dream interpretation was not only common but considered a serious practice, often conducted by shamans or seers called vulvas. These figures were believed to bridge the worlds, interpreting the messages and omens received during sleep or trance. For the Vikings, dreams could foretell the outcomes of battles, reveal hidden truths, or communicate with ancestors and gods. This elevated sleep from a passive state to an active spiritual experience. The psychological comfort that came from this belief likely enhanced their sleep quality. Knowing that sleep held meaning beyond the physical can reduce anxiety, foster peace, and encourage a relaxed mindset before rest. The Vikings' acceptance of sleep's power gave it a respected place in daily life, making the transition to slumber smoother and less fraught with worry. Additionally, Vikings used runes, mystical symbols carved into wood, bone, or stone, not only as tools of communication and magic, but also as protective charms placed near sleeping areas. Some of these runic inscriptions were meant to ward off evil spirits or bad dreams, creating a safe, sacred space for sleep. This practice was a form of early sleep hygiene, combining psychological reassurance with cultural ritual. It is important to note that while sleep was deeply valued, the Vikings were also practical and resilient. They understood that sleep could be interrupted by danger, illness, or the demands of their harsh environment. To adapt, they cultivated a form of light sleep or heightened awareness, especially among warriors and sentinels, who needed to remain alert even in rest. This adaptive sleep ensured survival while still allowing for the physical restoration that sleep provides. In summary, the Viking approach to sleep encompassed the physical, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions. Their environment supported rest through architecture and natural rhythms. Their culture honored sleep with ritual and community. Their spirituality elevated sleep to a sacred practice, and their resilience shaped adaptive strategies for survival. All these layers combined to create a sleep experience that was likely richer, deeper, and more meaningful than what many experience today. Understanding this ancient wisdom offers modern readers a powerful reminder that sleep is not just a biological necessity but a vital, sacred thread woven into the fabric of a balanced and fulfilling life. Another important factor that contributed to the Vikings' superior sleep was their daily exposure to natural light, which profoundly influenced their internal body clocks. Without artificial lighting, the cycles of day and night were clear and unambiguous. The eyes received strong signals from sunlight during the day, which helped regulate melatonin production and synchronize circadian rhythms, essential for falling asleep at the right time and staying asleep throughout the night. During the long summer days, when the sun barely dipped below the horizon, Vikings adapted by retreating into darkened spaces, using thick curtains and animal hides to simulate nighttime conditions. This intentional creation of darkness was an early form of light management to maintain healthy sleep patterns despite challenging natural conditions. In contrast, the long, dark winters provided extended hours of natural darkness, allowing Vikings to rest longer and deeper. The absence of light pollution meant their melatonin levels remained high during the night, enhancing sleep quality. The natural progression from dusk to dawn, unbroken by artificial light, helped their bodies enter the slow-wave sleep phases essential for physical restoration and memory consolidation. This clear separation between light and dark is something many modern people lack, contributing to widespread sleep disorders. The Viking experience demonstrates the critical role that environmental cues play in regulating sleep. Their daily lives also involved significant physical labor, farming, fishing, building, and traveling. This constant movement ensured that their bodies were physically tired by day's end, primed for restful sleep. Physical exertion, combined with the absence of stimulants like caffeine and sugar, created ideal conditions for natural sleepiness. Moreover, the Vikings' diet supported sleep health. Rich in omega-3 fatty acids from fish, root vegetables, whole grains, and fermented foods, their nutrition provided essential nutrients like magnesium and tryptophan, which aid in sleep regulation. Meals were typically consumed early in the evening, allowing ample time for digestion before bedtime. Social and emotional factors also played a role. Vikings lived in close-knit communities where social bonds were strong and emotional support was readily available. This sense of belonging and safety reduces stress and anxiety, known modern sleep disruptors. Communal sleeping arrangements further enhanced feelings of security and warmth, promoting deeper, uninterrupted sleep. Finally, the Vikings' spiritual beliefs added a layer of reverence to sleep. Dream interpretation and rituals surrounding rest underscored sleep's importance not just physically but metaphysically. This holistic approach, combining environment, lifestyle, nutrition, social structure, and spirituality, fostered a sleep experience that was profoundly restorative and balanced. As we reflect on these factors, it becomes evident that the Vikings, through necessity and cultural wisdom, cultivated some of the healthiest sleep practices in human history. Their example offers valuable lessons for modern society, encouraging a return to natural rhythms and respect for rest as a vital part of life. As we reach the end of this journey through Viking sleep, it becomes clear that their way of resting was deeply intertwined with every aspect of their lives: environment, culture, spirituality, and survival. Their world was harsh and demanding, yet they understood that rest was not a luxury but a necessity vital to strength, health, and resilience. They lived in harmony with the natural cycles of light and darkness, using architecture, clothing, and rituals to create sanctuaries of warmth and calm amid the cold and shadow. Their bodies, worn by hard labor and adventure, welcomed the embrace of sleep, which was both physical restoration and spiritual passage. Community bonds and shared spaces fostered security and comfort, easing minds and soothing souls. The Vikings honored sleep as a sacred time when dreams spoke truths, when the body healed, and when the spirit connected with the unseen. Their approach was holistic, practical, and profound, one that modern society could learn from in its frantic pursuit of productivity and artificial stimulation. In a world filled with screens, noise, and endless distractions, the Vikings remind us that true rest comes from simplicity, connection, and reverence for the rhythms that have guided humanity for millennia. Their sleep was not just better because of what they had, but because of what they respected: nature, community, and the deep need for rest. So tonight, as you lie down and close your eyes, consider the wisdom of those ancient people. In their darkness, warmth, and quiet, they found a sleep unmatched in history. Perhaps by embracing some of their rhythms and values, we too can reclaim the deep, peaceful rest that our bodies and minds crave. Good night, and may your sleep be as sound and restorative as the Vikings. Timeless, natural, and deeply healing.